and welcome to Strange Dominions, a show where we attempt to unlock the mysteries behind the unseen and the unheard, the unknown and the unknowable. I am your host, Octavian Graves. Tonight we're speaking with Bj Swain, author and magician. He has authored 2 books, Living Spirits and Luminaria. We are speaking tonight about ceremonial magic, its lineage and its language, the ecology of spirits, different grimoires, and how to work with spirits with the paranormal. If you had seen something strange or unusual, such as a cryptid, UFO, spirit, or anything in between, send me an email at strangedominionspodcast@gmail.com. That is strangedominionspodcast@gmail.com. If you would like to get extra content, extra episodes, and merchandise, and would like to support the show even further, you can become a patron just starting at $4 a month. All of the information and links will be in the show notes below. And with that, let's get into the episode. All right, I am here with Bj Swain, author and magician. How you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you again for coming on.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure because, Living Spirits I've recommended it to probably half the people I've had on this show just because of how wide of a material it is and how well it's researched and how well it's written. So, props to you for that because it's a really, really good book.
Thank you.
So where did this all kind of start for you? What is your background in all this?
I guess I talk about this a little bit in one of the books that I'm wrapping up now, where I'm writing about witchcraft and witch blood, and sort of a historical perspective on hereditary witchcraft.
Very cool.
Thank you. So I, as a small child, was always pretty called towards magic. I would always wish, like, whenever I would go out to like a wishing well or catch like a wisp in the air or anything like that, to grow up and be like a great magician. And it was what I always wanted. And when I was a kid, I would see spirits and interact with them and learn some basic magic things from them. And then around the time I was maybe 10 or 11, read a book where these kids found a magic book and they started experimenting with the magic book. And it was set in a very realistic world. It wasn't like a fantasy environment. So it was sort of the idea of these kids didn't have any idea that magic existed, and they find this book and they start exploring and find that magic's real. And that just seemed like this moment of, whoa, how did I never think of that before? How did I never realize that there are probably books on magic out there? Because I wanted to learn magic and didn't know where to go in order to learn it. And so my dad saw me checking out books on magic in the bookstore when we'd go hang out at the mall on the weekends. And so eventually he was like, okay, well, you're interested in this, so let's get you some books so that you can study it. And he was like, I'll look through the books, make sure we're not getting you anything that's got anything bad in it. And so got my first couple of magic books, got started with that, started out sort of in the neo-pagan witchcraft, neo-pagan magic kind of stuff. And then as I started high school, got really serious, like spent my nights like an entire summer just sitting up 24 hours a day reading magic stuff and studying and practicing and exploring, and started getting into Reconstructionist paganism, but also getting into ceremonial magic. And then as I got to college, started studying things academically, I did a degree in ancient history and archaeology and the Latin language. It's basically a classics degree. And then also studied Jewish mysticism, parapsychology, anthropology of witchcraft, all those sorts of things through different classes that I was taking in college in order to sort of deepen my exposure to what I was doing, and started hanging out around the OTO at that time as well. Eventually joined the OTO and had joined a branch of the AA a little bit before I did the OTO, but I was still in high school when I joined that, and kind of developed from there. And I'd always been more drawn to traditional historical magic and to spirit work. And even when I was involved in things like the OTO and studying contemporary ceremonial magic, I always had a sort of more spirit-based view of things. Like I kind of accepted the idea of there being energy everywhere and everything working with that. I never really got into the psychological model or the idea of like the meta model of like switching what you believe in any given moment to be convenient. Like I tried experimenting with those things, but they never really clicked. For me, everything was always real. And so then around the time that I was wrapping up college, started in with an order that was derived from the Golden Dawn system, but was run by a group of Orthodox Jewish people, and they were kind of trying to return more to historical Kabbalah and working with the Merkaba, historical alchemy, and things like that, and sort of rebuilding a Golden Dawn system using more traditional magic means. And I started exploring more stuff with that. And that was around the time, that was like 2005, 2006, when you started getting some of the Yahoo groups where people were looking at those things. And I was running a Yahoo group myself that was looking at that stuff. And so from there, started exploring conjuration and spirit work, and was kind of doing that for a while, dipped out of the public magic scene for a little while. And then as I came back, saw that everything had exploded and everyone was now in the spirit work, and there was more grimoire stuff going on, and Jake was publishing his books, Rufus was putting out his stuff, and I think Ashton Shashan had put out his first book. And so it was like, whoa, this is like super exciting time, and I was ready to kind of get back into things, and started my blog. And eventually on my blog, I decided I was going to do a series that was sort of a beginner guide to working with spirits. And so wrote like an 8-section booklet essentially, and published it as a series of 8 blog posts. And it was very popular. And I realized, like, I could take this and expand it and turn it into like a short book, like publish like a little booklet from this. And so I started working on that about maybe like a year later, half a year later, something like that. Excuse me. And after a few months of working on that, I decided like, oh, I need to talk about these other types of spirits I need to talk about. I need to expand all the stuff I talked about majorly. I need to put more practical work in there. And eventually that turned into Living Spirits. And so some of it was talking with Rufus Opus, and he was kind of like, yeah, the stuff you're putting together on the blog with this series of posts is really great, but it's all like pieces. Like, how does it tie together? How does it all work as one thing? And that really got me to look a little more at what I was doing and how I was working. And I had a lot of things where I was drawing from different types of spirit work and working with different types of spirits, and being influenced by the grimoire stuff, influenced by my witchcraft background. I had started studying some Kimbanda stuff, but never went through like any sort of initiation or anything with that, and was influenced by some of the ideas there. And so there was a lot of sort of piecemeal there. And I realized, like, okay, this is something where I need to look at how it all comes together into one cohesive system. And along the lines of that, as I was putting it together, I didn't really have a thought of how to address the type of thinking there. But then one day I was talking with Alison Tchaikovsky, and she brought up the idea of spirit ecologies. And I realized that was basically what I was doing, was going through and looking at where different spirits live, how that impacts how they work, how they interact with us, how we approach them, how that impacts how they're able to interact with each other, how we're able to approach them as a group, and looking at it from this sort of ecological perspective of what is the overall environment of the spirit world and our place in that environment, and the place of the various spirits in that environment. Because a lot of times we center on ourselves as humans and don't really think about how it's not a world that's centered around us. It's a world that has an infinite number of center points, and everything is standing at a center point. And so we have to be able to understand all these different perspectives and how they all work together. And trying to look at it that way and kind of sort of decode the spirit world that way sort of led to how the book got put together.
That is so awesome. And, I really envy you for having kind of like a magical childhood, because I remember going out as a kid. No, you and I are both residents of Maryland, right?
Yes.
Yes. So when I was a kid, I would have to like imagine stuff. So I would go out and tell my friends I'm looking for dragons or I'm looking for ghosts. And I never saw anything. I never had that kind of connection with the spirit world. It was just all in my, I had to envision it. So I'm very envious that you kind of had that introduction to this other world from such an early age.
Yeah, it definitely shapes things differently. And there's definitely stuff that I look at where I'm kind of like, well, I don't know, is it good for kids when they're adolescents to like have access to some of this and be doing some of this? And overall, I think it is, because I think it's useful developmentally. But all of those different things that kids go through, where you have all your emotional stuff, all your stuff as you're interacting with other people, and sort of the tantrums that we have as children, they get turned up a level when you've got magic as well. But I think as far as being able to appreciate the world magically and appreciate spirits that are out there and the experience of things, a lot of stuff people talk about, like Gordon White has talked about how, like, oh, we all had to go through our chaos magic phase and our psychological magic phase and come around to that in order to learn to be animists. And when he says things like that, or other people say things like that, I'm like, what? We did what? Who had to do what? Because it's like I didn't go through that. And I mean, I was around in the 90s when that was the thing. I mean, I was a high schooler, but was on forums and talking with people online and exploring magic stuff. And sometimes I would get on forums and start raging about people looking at the world that way. And because for me, it was just like, well, this is what I've always been grounded in. This is what the world's always looked like. There was never a point where I had people telling me, oh, none of this is real. You can't believe in this. Don't think about this. And so when they talk about that in books where it's like, oh, we learn to turn off that part of our brains, we learn to turn off that part of our minds, that's kind of foreign to me. Like I never went through that. And I hope there's a lot of people that never went through that, because I think it's pretty great to have always been able to experience the world that way.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that you've seen, because we're friends on Facebook and we're in a couple of the same magical groups, about my my attitude and opinions on people who feel the need to be nice to demons and that whole thing. So I think we're on the same wavelength with that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
One of the things that I really liked about the book was how you were able to explain the lineage of traditional Solomonic magic and just how far back these techniques go. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's one of the interesting things to consider about magic. And as you mentioned, like people's contemporary views on demons, even considering that, a lot of times people talk about how demons were just these gods of these other religions, and Christians came in and decided they were demons. And it's like, well, no, the whole world has demons. Like every culture has vexing spirits and has means to deal with vexing spirits. And then stepping out of the sort of magico-medical approach of getting rid of the influence of those spirits into an approach of controlling the influence of those spirits and using them, that's a big part of magic in a lot of places in history prior to Christianity. And it's something where, as you start exploring that history, that becomes a lot more evident that that's something that's always been there in all of these cultures. And so, like, sure, there might be places where we've attached names that are associated with ancient gods onto demons. But if we look at these cultures that we say these gods would have come from, they were doing the same thing. If we go back to Mesopotamia, where we have our earliest examples of writing, we have our earliest examples of what we would recognize as urban culture, what survives, in addition to like shopping lists and accounting books, are rituals and magical instructions for dealing with the effects of witchcraft, for dealing with the effects of demons, for dealing with the wild spirits of the desert and the wilderness, and the spirits that cause sickness, and getting rid of their influence. And the way that that's done historically is calling upon the power of some god and using the sacredness of that god and their name and binding the demon through that power, either setting the god upon impacting the demon in some way, as we see implied with the thwarting angels idea in the Testament of Solomon, or commanding the demon through some agreement based on the power of that god to impact you and impact the demon, which is, I think, something that people sometimes miss about the idea of conjuration, is that it's not just the demon being bound by the name, but it's an agreement between the demon and the human in a space that's negotiated between them and the divine and the earthly nature of the space. And so every part of the agreement, every party who is there, so the spirit, the nature spirits involved, the time, the place, the spirits that control that, the human that's doing the conjuration, all of them have some impact from the power of the divine name and the oath that's sworn on that name. And that divine name or that divine power is basically there as a, well, I'm going to keep you all to this and make sure that everything goes the way it's supposed to go. And we can look back at magic historically and see that in surviving Akkadian materials. We can see things like that. I'm not as versed in the Egyptian stuff, but from what I've seen, there's definitely elements that overlap that with the Egyptian stuff. And so I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of that operates in a similar way. And with trade and interaction and people moving and war through those regions, it would make sense that there would be cultural sharing and therefore magical sharing through all of those peoples. We see that in Greek magic, not just in the PGM, but we see things where we're using the spirits of the dead, we're using spirits of places, we're using different gods, we're using the powers that bind nature together that the gods swear by in order to compel magical acts by spirits, as we look at things like Defixiones. And then, of course, as we get to the texts that we now refer to as the Greek magical papyri, the various collections of texts that have been in those various hoards and fragments that have been collected by antiquarians over the years, we see rituals that basically clearly set out a pattern that is almost a prototype for Solomonic magic. I think sometimes we get a little too excited trying to say that Solomonic magic is a continuation of Greek Goetic magic and that all goes back to Egyptian magic. There's a lot of things that were overlapping and that were sort of separate and then maybe had trade and interaction with each other and influenced each other over time. But when we look at some of the important Solomonic texts that we're talking about, not important Solomonic texts, I'm sorry, important papyri that we're talking about, some of those, like, we're living in a time that's closer to like the earliest manuscripts of the Ars Notoria than some of those papyri were to the earliest manuscripts of the Key of Solomon. And even when we're looking at like the Hygromantia texts as something as a link of continuation, because, well, these are Byzantine and so they're Greek. Well, Byzantine culture and classical Greek culture aren't the same, and classical Greek culture and Greco-Egyptian culture aren't the same. And these are all, and Greco-Egyptian culture is in a place that's pretty remote from Byzantine culture, and there's hundreds of years between these texts and the papyri. So the idea that there's like a direct continuation of communication there is a tenuous idea. The idea that these ideas and practices continued, and that there's probably other texts along the way that we just don't have access to anymore. That's a pretty real idea. And so there is probably a lot of indirect influence from the papyri on the things that we see in the Grimoire tradition. Honestly, a lot of what we're getting in the Grimoire tradition is more influenced by the fall of Byzantine culture, releasing Greek and European magical and esoteric traditions into Arabic culture, and then Arabic culture feeding that back into European culture later on. And so we get some shaping from the way that Arabic culture addressed those things. And I think that's starting to be explored a little more as we're starting to get more things released from some of the Arabic equivalent to the Grimoire tradition, and more translation of some of those Arabic texts, not just in popular occult printing, but also in academic magical study. And some of the academics out there who are publishing and writing about magic have talked about how important it is to learn Arabic and learn Near Eastern languages, because that's an area that hasn't really been tapped in Western study of the history of the occult as much, but it's an important link that's there. And as we're seeing more things with people looking at the Almondale practices and looking at influences from the Picatrix and influences from scholastic image magic and things like that, we're starting to see more people studying and looking at how important that strand of communication was. And so as we're looking at that history, again, you've got basically things where we can look back to, again, Akkadian and Assyrian texts, where you've got some of the earliest cuneiform writing out there, laying out things where we're binding demons by using names of the divine, and we're doing things that are essentially the same magical practices that we're doing today, just with different powers and different gods and different verbiage. And then we can see things like that through Greek and Egyptian traditions. We can see it as the Greek and Egyptian traditions merge into the Greco-Egyptian traditions. We definitely see it by the time we're looking at Byzantine magic and looking at like the Hygromantia. We see things like that as we look at some of the Arabic sources. And then by the time all of that comes together in the late medieval up through early modern European grimoire texts, then we're seeing what it is that we're familiar with now. But we can trace that thread all the way back through history and see that it's something that's been relatively continuous, which I think is kind of an interesting thing to look at with magic, is it's not just people making up something new constantly. It's a thread where people are exploring the same things and using the same technology. And it makes sense that there's something to it if it's something that's going to endure through thousands and thousands of years and multiple changes of culture, not just communicating from one culture to another, but over time as these cultures rise and fall and die out, and there's different religious systems and different belief systems. And even as we've moved through the industrial age and the computer age and looking at a society where everyone sort of assumes a materialist base to our culture, even though if you really look at it, we can very clearly understand that that intense acceptance of materialism has not ever really been the way things were. I think maybe we're starting to get to that a little bit with some of the younger millennials and the Zoomers.
I was going to ask you if you felt that was kind of like fading away, like in a certain degree in our modern times.
Yeah, I think that like when I was growing up, there was definitely like I went to Catholic schools, and there were kids who would come to me and ask for stuff and be like, I don't feel comfortable praying to God for this because it's about trying to get with a girl, or it's about wanting this thing that I don't think is like a good Catholic thing to want. But since you're a witch, I can come to you and ask you to do magic for me. And so people who ostensibly would be people who don't believe in magic, don't believe in witchcraft, there's still belief when they were presented with the opportunity. There's still that fear that people have about those things. And I've had times where I've had coworkers who would bring stuff up about that, whether they knew about my involvements or not. And it was very clear that they had some fear and some belief about those things, even if it was stuff that they wouldn't ever dream of exploring or practicing. And if they thought of themselves as relatively average modern people otherwise. I think it's something that most people have had some belief in. And I feel like most people tend to have some moment or experience where they see something or hear something or experience or notice something that's a little bit inexplicable. And a lot of times people who become magical people are people who explore that thing that they see or experience. But your average person maybe kind of just like shudders a little bit and is like, oh, that was weird, and then moves on. But as I work with college students and I work with middle and high school students, and don't get into conversations with the middle and high school students about stuff like this, but with the college students, I get to have fairly personable interactions with them, and most of them know about stuff that I do. Some of them know about my books, and I think a couple of them have even bought copies just out of curiosity. And there's a lot less religious adherence with as we move closer into the Zoomers, and I think as we're seeing in a lot of polls, we're starting to, like, every few years they're like, oh, this is the biggest drop in religious participation. This is the biggest drop. But people who adhere to the major religions have still been in the majority. And now we're actually starting to get meaningful shifts in that. And I'm definitely seeing more and more of my college students where they very casually are kind of like, yeah, no, I grew up Christian, I grew up Jewish, I grew up this or that. I don't really believe any of it. Like it's not really a thing to me. And it's not so much you get into college and it's not important to you, and so you kind of don't pay attention to it, but the belief is there in the background. And then when you get ready to settle down and have kids, you'll probably go back to it because you figure you should raise your kids in a religious context, which I've seen a lot in people older than me as well as my peer group. But it seems more like they're just kind of like, yeah, I went and did these things, but I have no idea what I was doing, and none of it meant anything to me. And like it's just a complete disconnect. So I'm wondering if we will start to see that myth of materialism actually kind of begin manifesting now. On the flip side, though, you have like witch talk, and you have tons and tons of
witch talk.
Yeah, kids going out like telling us all that we're horrible people because we read tarot, and tarot is somehow a closed practice, despite the fact that it was just a card game from Italy and France. So I guess like there is still a boom and things like that. And I guess if you look in like the Wicca forums online, where I guess, and this is not to insult Wicca in any way, but there is sort of the lowest bar to entry there. You get a lot of people where they feel comfortable saying that they adhere to that practice or part of that practice, where they've read some websites or like seen some documentaries and maybe read a news article and just decide like, oh, that's me. And they don't need to explore anything else beyond joining some forums. And I think because there's that level of openness and sort of egalitarian, do whatever you want kind of feel in those spaces. And I'm not saying that characterizes Wicca in general, because of course, traditional initiatory Wicca is a lot meatier than that. And even like actual like eclectic Wicca is a lot meatier than that. And definitely has things that can be valuable and useful. The idea that there are these spaces where people can come in and say, oh, I'm involved in magic, I'm involved in spirituality, but it's all just my own things that I like, and I'm just going to like make a simmer pot and stir my tea with some intentions and think about my intentions, and that makes me magical and spiritual. Maybe there's not a lot going on there, but it is definitely showing that there's still a lot of people, even amongst young people, who they do want something more than a purely materialist world. So, I mean, maybe the idea that like there's less people who are identifying with the religions that they grew up in, and maybe that there's not an easy vocabulary for discussing being religious or having religious beliefs without adhering to those religions we grew up in. People who are like sort of casual about it and don't want to put the time in to understand what else is out there, understand how to discuss the things that they believe or feel. It might just be that it looks like there's more people who don't believe anything, but there's probably still a lot of people who feel some call to something or feel that there's something out there.
I love the way you said that, and I definitely resonate with that because, when I was growing up, my family is what I would call Jutheist, where, we're culturally Jewish, but we never really considered the religious aspect. And I kind of felt that way for a long time, but I still held on to these, obviously the paranormal is very big with me, and a belief in spirits that came completely from my own interests. Like, it was never an indoctrination kind of thing. I've had this stuff from a very early age just within myself, and I feel that it kind of it feels stronger for me because of how innate it is for me and not kind of built into my family or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that your book I really learned a lot from, which is the Protestant effect, or how the Protestantism affected grimoire magic, and also the more esoteric nature of Catholicism and how it kind of changed the game for all of that. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
And I think it's something that there's a lot of layers to unpack there, and it's something I definitely would like to explore and study more, because there's the very surface easy thing of Catholicism was and is a religious mystery tradition. Like, you have the way a lot of people approach Catholicism as there's the magisterium, and you listen to what the magisterium has put out there, and you just do what you're told and do what you're supposed to do as a Catholic, and show up and recite these prayers and go to mass and observe your holy days of obligation and go to confession. But then there's this whole deeper element of it, of you go through things like Stations of the Cross, where you are experiencing the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ, so that becomes part of your being, just like it would be if you were going through the Eleusinian mysteries and experiencing the abduction of Persephone and understanding that process, so that it becomes part of your being and informs how you understand death and continuation after death. It's very much a tradition of initiation, and even for people who aren't necessarily engaging it that way, the consecration of the Eucharist has built into it the idea that the mysteries of Christ's life are encoded into the Eucharist, so that every person who consumes it, it's not just that you're consuming the body and blood of Christ, you're consuming the Holy Spirit and the presence of the Holy Spirit. And so you're receiving some piece of what the apostles received at Pentecost, and some piece of what bishops passed from one to another through apostolic succession. And you're also encoding into it the actual life of Christ. And so all of the moments that he experienced and all of the elements of his life that convey the basic elements of the various mystery traditions, those things are part of what becomes part of your being, so that even if you're not engaging it directly and exploring it deeply, there's still that hope that it's taking root in your soul in some way, and becoming part of who you are, and sort of repairing you in order to prepare you for the afterlife. And Catholicism has a huge death cult element to it, which I think a lot of people miss, maybe with modern American Catholicism, even though sometimes it's still there. But the whole cult of the saints, the fact that like you have to have relics at churches, the memento mori, or sort of the icons of death, those are all big parts of Catholic devotion. And so even if you're not fully engaging Catholic tradition is about creating real spiritual changes and development in order to prepare you for death. But if you're really engaging it, then there's this whole deep spirit tradition and a deep esoteric and mystery tradition that has a lot of its roots in Neoplatonism, and it draws from a lot of things that are still connected to kind of ancient pagan practices. And I think Jesse Hathaway puts it really well, that Catholicism is a universal tradition. That's what Catholic means, is universal. And so when Catholicism would come into a place and absorb that place, it wasn't always this process of demonizing everything that was there, the way that a lot of modern people like to assert that it was. A lot of times it was absorbing what was there and finding a way to make it Catholic. And some of that depended upon what particular order of priests were coming in and sort of like the missionaries dealing with a place and what period you're dealing with. But throughout most of history, we see things where, okay, there's this Catholic saint, but we can look back and this saint was based on this spirit or this figure that was already venerated in this place. Or there's this holiday, and that holiday draws from this holiday or this tradition that was already going on in this place. And it's not so much the idea of Christians stealing pagan rites or stealing pagan traditions, so much as these gods and spirits and traditions and holidays belong to the people that were in these places. And so when Catholicism came into these places, these people still had their traditions and their experiences. And so they just became part of a Catholic world and were then understood through a lens that made sense in an overall Catholic cosmology. And even that Catholic cosmology, when we look at a lot of its people who kind of organized and built it, you have people like St. Augustine, who again came out of a background of Neoplatonism and a background of sort of educated, esoteric, pagan understanding, and that those things were influenced in building the way that Catholicism was built in those areas. And so when we look at that, you can kind of see the Catholic Church and see that, okay, it's never been just this baseline of get in line and do what you're told and just don't believe in anything except what you're told to believe and don't experience anything in the world. It's always been something that's been set up to allow people to engage the spiritual and deepen people's engagement of the spiritual and deepen what people are able to connect with that. And it's something where if you look historically at lots of parts of the world, and not even just historically, even in contemporary times where you have more impact of various traditions and things that predated Catholicism, then you still have a lot of cultures where people are still living those things and doing those things in addition to that Catholicism. And so you have more room for double faith there than you have in a lot of the Protestant traditions. But when we look at the Protestant Reformation, a lot of what we talk about the Protestant Reformation frequently deals with the idea of rooting out corruption that was in the church, rooting out the idea that the church was a space for people to make money or control the populace or control what the populace was thinking by keeping religious texts in Latin instead of in the vernacular and keeping the Mass in Latin instead of the vernacular and making things too complicated and difficult for people to understand. And that by making things such that they were simple and in language people could deal with, and that they didn't have all of these esoteric or mystical components, then it was something that everyone could approach and everyone could deal with it, and you didn't need priests to interpret it. And that made it accessible. A lot of times we treat that like, oh, these are the good things about the Protestant Reformation, and this was the stuff that the Protestant Reformation was able to influence Catholicism with, and that Catholicism was able to survive because it had its Counter-Reformation and it took some of these good ideas from the Reformation and impacted how Catholicism dealt with things. And then we get to Vatican II hundreds of years later, and it goes even further with taking those things into account. The other side of the Reformation, though, is that the Reformation was very much trying to cut out a lot of the things in Catholicism that they were saying weren't biblical, or things that we couldn't track to the gospel, and trying to strip Catholicism down into something that, by being more approachable and less mystical, was less of an esoteric tradition. And so in removing those things, you remove all of the engagement with the mysteries. And so it removes any space for dealing with saints, for dealing with icons, for dealing with any sorts of spirits that have been absorbed into Catholicism and any of the rich cultural traditions of the places that Catholicism came into, because you just can't have room for that if you're saying, like, okay, we're doing something that's only purely based on the gospel, and we're doing something that you can just kind of go in for an hour on Sunday and listen to a guy talk, and that's what you're getting out of it. There's not room for a mystery tradition there. There's not room for magic. And as you start to strip out those ideas of authority and power, and you strip out that apostolic succession and therefore the power of the Holy Spirit and the things that that's supposed to convey, which with that's supposed to convey the ability to heal, to command spirits, to perform miracles, all of that's being removed. And so in doing that, you basically have to remove magic from the world. And I think what becomes more interesting in unpacking that is, again, that's kind of where you can have the sort of surface reading of it, where you're saying, okay, Catholicism was good because it was all mystical and esoteric and have room for absorbing all of these cultures and room for the magical components of things. And Protestantism was bad because it got rid of all that. And it was just here, listen to a story and drink some grape juice. But when we go back and look at the history a little more deeply than that, we see things where the Rosicrucian movement was a Protestant movement. And so that was where you're trying to have alchemy and Hermeticism in Protestantism. Paracelsus, a lot of his followers were Protestants and were tied up with Protestant publishing and kind of the spread of Protestant ideals. And Gori, the author, or the likely author of the Arbatel and a few other magical texts, was a Protestant thinker. And the Arbatel was originally published by a Protestant publishing partnership. And it definitely reflects Protestant ideals. And in fact, Paracelsus experts frequently talk about how his entire corpus of work is essentially a commentary on Protestant theology, and it's his way of trying to explain the world from this Protestant theological basis, almost in the way that Catholicism sort of tried to adopt everything else that was in the world into a Catholic worldview. And so Protestantism didn't immediately remove everything. There were attempts still to address the world that people were seeing, the world that people were experiencing, and find ways that could exist in a Protestant milieu, just the way Catholicism had done. But whereas that became an entrenchant strength in Catholicism that helped build Catholicism into what it was, for Protestantism, it was more of a blip. And so it was something where early Protestantism, as it was sort of figuring out what it was, kind of dealt with those things, but for the most part, let them go and sort of move towards this more materialist world that was kind of a lot of the basis of a lot of the ideas that we would think of as modernity and sort of the early modern world, which is reflective of when Protestantism was developing. But then again, as we get a few centuries later, you have in like the 19th century with the Burned Over District, you've got the advent of Christian Science and the New Thought movement, and those are things that are growing out of Protestantism. And so a lot of things that shape stuff like the Kybalion and a lot of the thinking of theosophy and of those sorts of systems that led to a lot of the parts of the modern magical revival that weren't based in historical magic are things that are kind of influenced and partially coming out of Protestantism, Protestant movements. And even the New Age movement draws a lot of its basis from kind of the New Thought movement and from a lot of those ideas that we as Americans tend to think are part of the basic elements of human thinking, of like the power of positivity and of creative visualization and of affirmation. Even though those are the things that really kind of came out of those movements, a lot of those things are sort of central to the shaping of the thought that informs the New Age movement. And so as much as people would be like, oh, the New Age movement, it's so far away from your kind of dry bread, cheap grape juice, Sunday afternoon Protestantism, that's a lot of it kind of has its core and its roots there also.
One of the things I've always kind of noted about the New Age movement is that as much as it tries to get away from any kind of like monotheistic duality, it really retains that in a lot of ways about how they view what they do versus what the ceremonial magicians do or anything like that. There's a very much still a us versus them mentality and a lot of New Age thought that I always found very ironic.
Yeah, and well, I think because it's still a very monist tradition, like it's still very much based on the idea that you have this singular monad and everything is based on that, and the fundamental ability for anything to work the way that that tradition says is based on the idea that everything is this same substance, and the idea of the sort of perennialism or universalism that all spiritual and religious traditions are coming down to the same concept is based on the idea that it's all the same substance and everything is this same basic thought particle that everything is made from. Uh, it's just another form of that concept that everything comes from one original source. And so it kind of makes sense that if you're taking something where you've got the most monotheistic of monotheisms as your basis, and then they're trying to approach that almost in a kind of Unitarian stripped down sort of way, where you have all of the mythology taken out of it and all the symbolism taken out of it, then you're going to end up with that sort of all is mind kind of concept.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. One of the other things that I definitely really enjoyed about the Living Spirits is how you talk about the. Well, I guess we'll start off by saying that I've always hoped is that this show is 50% paranormal people and 50% magicians or magical people. And so for the people that are not so much in the magical camp and more in the paranormal camp, do you think you could just explain to them the sort of if there's a difference between terms such as, conjuration, evocation, summoning, are they all basically different words for the same thing, or are there any differences in those terms?
I think you could give a very simple answer where you say those terms are all basically the same thing. And for a lot of people, that would be a useful enough answer. It would be a useful enough approach to say, like, all of these things are basically the idea that you're calling on some sort of spirit or power and binding it to some sort of agreement in order to work or interact with you. As you really start to dig into it, if you want to get nuanced and technical, and there's a lot of benefit to doing that if it's something that people are really exploring, then those terms all kind of have different elements and different meanings. So if you're talking conjuration, then that's specifically something where a spirit is being bound. And so it's the same as exorcism. They are essentially synonyms. And they both come from the idea of binding by law or binding by oath. And so you have something where you have a divine power or a divine name, and through the power of that divine name and the presence and the agency and sort of authority that divine power has, then the magician and the spirit are bound to whatever agreement is being made in the context of that conjuration. When you talk about summoning, then that could mean a conjuration, but it could also mean anything where you're asking something to show up. And so that could be going out into the local forest and asking the local woodland spirits to talk to you. It could be going out and leaving butter and cream for the fair folk and asking them to come and interact with you. Or it could be setting up a whole Solomonic conjuration and conjuring an angel or a demon. When we look at the word evocation, that's one that has a long history of people trying to attach a lot of specifics to it. And so you get the idea of evocation as calling something so that it appears outside of your circle, and invocation and as calling something so it appears in your circle. The delineation that I grew up with was the idea that evocation was calling something to appear before you, and invocation was calling something to channel through you. There's a lot of different ways that people try to divide those out. In reality, invocation and evocation are synonyms. They just mean to kind of very intensely call upon something. And so that could mean that you are summoning something, you're calling something to appear, or it could mean that you're asking something to intercede or to interact or to help in some way. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean that something's coming. So when we talk about the various phases of Solomonic work, it usually starts out with the consecration, which is kind of the hallowing of the ground and the hallowing of the tools and any sort of purifications and consecration of the magician or any assistants that are going to be there. And then we talk about a phase of invocation, which is usually used to refer to the calling of the divine in order to facilitate the conjuration. So you will kind of call upon the divine to make the circle, call upon the divine to bless the robes and the incense and the swords and candles and tools, and bless the magician themselves. But then the magician will go into the circle and they'll have whatever prayers for God to send his grace, his wisdom, the Holy Spirit, to send one of his angels, to send whatever he's going to send in order to facilitate the actual conjuration of the spirit. And then we divide out the next phase as evocation. And in that evocation phase, that's where we actually will have the verbiage where we're conjuring the spirit to appear. And it's important to note that in that point, you're conjuring the spirit to appear. You're using divine names to make the spirit show up. And then there are other phases where you use divine names to make the spirit stay in a particular place and appear in a particular way. And then another phase where you're using divine names to make the spirit answer your questions or do the things you want it to do. And so there's essentially 3 phases of conjuration in Solomonic ritual. And each one has its own thing that it does. So any given one of them could be successful, regardless of whether or not the other ones necessarily are. And so that's another thing that's useful in considering the nuance and breaking down the pieces of it. But that first conjuration phase gets referred to as evocation, where we're breaking down how the phases work. But it's a little redundant to call one phase invocation and one phase evocation, because again, the words kind of mean the same thing. But we're establishing there that we understand that in this context, one has a particular function, one has another function. Similarly, we talk about ligation and we talk about binding, and ligation is essentially to tie something up, and so that's the same as binding. Those words again are basically synonyms, but we use them to refer to different phases. And so in one, we're binding the spirit to like be pretty and not be scary, and to stand in the place that we want it to stand, or to show up physically, or to talk in a voice that's comprehensible. And in the other phase, you're binding it to not hurt anybody and to go and get you your Maserati and not burn down a village, or whatever it is you're asking it to do and not do, or to just answer some questions.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things is when you talk to people who are very wrapped up in the modern perception of magic, and you start talking about binding of spirits, they get very upset, and they really don't like that term, because I think that they see it as we're somehow hurting the spirit or being cruel to the spirit. And from what I understand of Solomonic magic, it's not so much that, it's just getting them to agree to what we want them to do, and for them to also agree that they're not going to hurt anyone or do anything that we don't ask in the process of them doing what we ask. And there is something for them to gain in this. I mean, there is offerings to spirits on the condition that they do as they're told. So it's not so much that we're hurting them, it's just kind of like a business transaction, just kind of a very forceful one.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about it, like when you take a job, then you agree that you're going to show up at the job, you're going to do certain duties, and the employer is agreeing that they're going to provide the facility for the job and they're going to pay you for the job. You're binding the employer to that part of the agreement. The employer is binding you to that part of the agreement. You're making an oath that those things are going to happen. It's the same thing. Now, as far as stuff like putting a sfotita on the coal, or burning the seal, or smiting the seal with the sword, or whatever, like those various ways of, or like swearing to cast the spirit into the chains of hell, or any number of things that could be done there. I think there's a little more room to debate that, whether or not all of that's necessary or useful. But also, like, if you're going to go play with lions, you're not going to go play with lions in your underwear with no weapons or tools to protect you. You're going to have things to deal with the behavior of lions. And so it's the same thing here. And I think one thing that people don't always consider is that demons aren't humans. So, yeah, like, what is bad to them, what is unfair to them, what is wrong as a form of treatment for them, is not necessarily the same as it would be for people, because they don't have the same perspective that people have. They don't have the same concerns that people have, and they don't have the same physical nature that people have. And so, whereas these things might be vexing for them, or they might be controlling for them, it may not have the same sort of traumatic or negative impact that something like that would have on a person. And so it might. I can't say 100% that it doesn't. I also can't say 100% that it does. So I don't know that we can necessarily judge all of those things based on using the same sort of criteria for behavior that we would with people. And I think that there's definitely ways that you can build interactions that don't have to be based on all of that. You can build interactions based on relationships. You can build interactions based on trade and offerings. You can build interactions based on networks where you have connections with your ancestors, or connections with saints, or with angels, or with various authorities and hierarchy. And so you can use those in order to broker the way an interaction goes, without necessarily having to escalate the interaction to, all right, I'm going to put a bunch of foul smelling things in the censer, and then I'm going to toss your seal in the censer and burn you up with these foul smelling things. Like, but I mean, maybe there's a point where that has to be the point that you get to. Like, it should still be something that people understand and know how to do if they're going to do that, even if it's something that they don't want to do. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be the thing that you jump to right away either.
Right, and I absolutely agree. And one of the things that that kind of goes into is that you talk about a lot of different kinds of spirits outside of what we would normally find in the medieval or Renaissance grimoires. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about working with these other kinds of spirits, and also kind of combining that question with how you feel magic, and specifically ceremonial and traditional magic, can be used in contacting what we would consider kind of contemporary paranormal entities.
Okay, so big question. So I think that as we're looking at other types of spirits, aside from those ones that we conventionally see in the grimoires, then we have to take into account a couple different things. So for some of those, maybe working with them in a context that's the same as the grimoires, or like the grimoires, might be reasonable. For others, it wouldn't be reasonable. Like, you wouldn't call up one of your ancestors in the same sort of ceremony that you would find in the Ars Goetia. I've seen people talk about calling their ancestors into the triangle and using the chain of Solomon to call their ancestors. And I'm like, well, you do you, but I can't see where that is the appropriate way of handling that. I think we have to look at, like, the nature of the spirits as far as, like, how we're going to approach them. I think we also have to look at where they reside, because that could impact how we want to approach them too. If you're dealing with something that lives in the infernal realms or lives in the celestial realms, then you've got to call it up. You can't go to where it is and try to deal with it there. But if you're dealing with something that lives in the world, the sort of normal terrestrial world, then you can go to the space that it inhabits and talk to it there. You don't have to necessarily call it to you. you can go and you can obtain things related to the space where that spirit is and bring it back to your space and kind of create a space that is an interaction between its space and your space, and use that to connect with it, rather than some sort of forceful conjuring or summoning type of approach. So you want to take those sorts of things into account as to how that ecology comes into play, like how things reside, where they reside. You also want to look at their nature. Is this something that's going to be relatively amenable to interacting with you, or is it going to be something that's going to be relatively antagonistic, or something that's going to be sort of more neutral? If it's more antagonistic, then you might need a more formal approach. If it's more amenable, then you might need a more basic approach, and there may be times where a more formal approach is appropriate, but that'll still shape what a formal approach looks like. I think also you want to look at where things reside and how they behave as far as what they're going to be useful for. So something that is more connected to the world might be more useful for things that are more material or related to the world. Something that's loftier might be more useful for information or inspiration or learning things. Something that's deep within the chaos of the world might be able to move things around, and so that might still be useful for changing actual things in the world, as opposed to just trying to get information about things. So all of those things are factors to consider as well. You would want to look at the history and mythology related to those sorts of figures and what it is that they do, because that will tell you more about what things that they would be best approached for and what things maybe not to approach them for. And if there's any particular sort of taboos or things that you need to think of avoiding when approaching them. Like there's sort of the popular kind of left-hand path influenced idea of just put blood on everything and just give everything blood. And there are some cultures where, yeah, that's what their spirits want, but there's others where it's like that's incredibly offensive to them and they wouldn't want that. And so that's a bad idea there. So you have to take those things into account as well. One thing that I've been looking at recently is the fair folk, and how in early modern grimoires we see Sibylla, we see Oberon, we see a host of other fairy creatures, and the way that they're dealt with, they're conjured very similarly to the way that the infernal spirits are conjured, and almost with more extreme conjurations that are longer and more intense in some places. And looking at that, I'm like, well, this is like a sovereign king or a sovereign queen of like another people. Why would it be called this way? Like it has nothing to do with that system or that tradition or those beliefs. Like, why would that be how it would be called? And maybe it shows up. Maybe it shows up because it's curious. Maybe it shows up because it's like you have a bat in your hand and you're waving the bat around and you're like, you better get over here. And it's like, okay, well, I don't want to like ignore this crazy person with the bat because who knows what they're going to do. So there's probably better ways, but we could still look at ways that are informed by that same pattern and structure, because again, they're still figures where maybe they're not the same as the infernal spirits, but they are still spirits where, and actually, I guess historically, there are points where they wouldn't even have been viewed as spirits. They would have been viewed as almost people or beings that are like us. But they have their own sort of legalistic view of things and contractual view of things and their own culture and their own way of looking at how people should behave and interact with one another, and they can be very severe about that. And so having something where there creates a structure, where there creates protection, where there creates restrictions could still be useful, but maybe doing ones that are based on the powers that they recognize and the powers that they interact with and the things that are adjacent to them, rather than things that are foreign to them, but that we know work on these other spirits. And so where we've sort of adopted them in to that kind of grimoire pattern because that's what was being done at the time, maybe that's not the best way, but maybe we can still be inspired by that and look at that and say like, okay, this gives us a structure, but maybe these aren't the right powers, the right names to use in that structure. And so I think as we explore out further, we have to take things like that into consideration, whether or not they fit the structure perfectly or they need to fit the structure in a slightly different way than the way other things have fit the structure. Now, as far as the kind of paranormal stuff, I think that is something that can be really interesting, and it's something that I have not explored a ton, but it's something I've definitely given thought to, and kind of going around hearing ghost stories on ghost tours and looking at like places that are supposed to have a lot of haunting or spirit activity, and looking at some of the folklore around like what sorts of different paranormal or spirit activities out there. I think a lot of the explanations that get given in that context are very different than the explanations that get given in a magical context. But I doubt that there's a reality to there being a huge difference, because why would a single world operate in two dramatically different ways?
Well, I think one
So
thing you kind of have to consider when you're looking at the paranormal is that within the paranormal realm and how the people who are into the paranormal, there's a lot of smaller fringe group, but the two big camps that people fall into are when it comes to like things like cryptids and stuff like that, or UFOs. They're very like, these are natural phenomena. There's nothing weird or supernatural about it. It's kind of almost like a materialist point of view on it. And then you have the other camp, which are a very evangelical, church-going kind of people who view all of this stuff as demons or something ostensibly evil. And because they still have that very modern church view of magic as being tools of the devil, when we start talking about using magic as a way of contacting the paranormal, that's like a big red flag to them, and they get very, very upset. I've dealt with that with this show. When I start talking about using magic to contact entities in the paranormal, I get a lot of people who are like, you can't be doing that because it's against God and things like that. And so there's always that to consider when trying to look at seeing how people look at the paranormal in relation to magic.
I think that makes sense. And I guess that would also make sense, as those are sort of like the two biggest populations. That's where you would get a divide of people being one way or the other. I suppose to me, what's always made sense is to kind of look at them in the context that you'd look at any other spirits within any other culture and mythology, and that this is basically just a contemporary view of folklore, the same way that we would look at the folk wisdom of any indigenous people, or the folk wisdom of any people that are kind of either pre-industrial or are still living folk ways even through into modern times, and how they would look at interacting with the phenomenon in the world around them. And that if we kind of engage them that way, then a lot of it starts to make some clear sense. Because if we look at a lot of things historically, you'll see things where nature spirits in one culture will be good, positive, beneficial, helpful spirits. And then at some point, the myths and stories change, and then they become these terrifying, frightening spirits, or they become spirits that are dangerous, or spirits that watch over places that you shouldn't go because they're dangerous and dark and scary things there. And that's not to say that like all stories of dangerous, dark, scary things are things where like it used to be a story of something good and then it became a story of something bad. But there are definitely some where you can see that, where it will be the same thing. And if you look at stories from one period or one people, then it's like, oh, this was a good thing. And then you look at stories from another period or another people, and it's like, oh, this is this terrifying thing. But often they're very related in terms of how they behave, whether they're behaving adaptively for humans or maladaptively for humans. And I don't think this is the same thing as kind of the idea of when a new culture comes in, they take the good spirits or gods of an old culture and they make them evil. I think it's a thing about interaction, and how, as our interactions with nature and our interactions with spaces and our interactions with the other things that live in spaces change, then their interaction with us will change as well. And so you have things where something might have been a good, useful, helpful thing at some point, but then we cut down its forest, or we pave over its field, or we stop giving it the things that people historically gave it, or we just ignore it. And so it cries out, and it's pained, and it's alone, and it's looking for something. And so it acts out until it's able to get some sort of attention, and it acts out because it's trying to lash out against whatever harm was done to it. And so that's where we get like sort of the scary stories in folklore and the scary stories of paranormal things. In some cases, in other cases, things are just bad and are just dangerous. We should just pay attention to that. But that was something that I wrote about a little bit in Living Spirits.
Yeah, because you talked about Goatman as being kind of just a general murderous spirit, and I thought that was an interesting perspective.
Yeah, and so that's one where it's like, is this something where it is just this general murderous spirit, or is maybe there was a time where there was a spirit that was kind of related to it that was nicer, and because people interacted with it better. I think water spirits sometimes are like that, where you get some cultures where you'll have water spirit that's like super dangerous and super scary, but then you'll have the same water spirit in other stories where it's like really helpful and really nice. And I think there is kind of a trend to danger with water spirits because they are dangerous, because water's dangerous. But it definitely shows us that there are points where if a culture is interacting with them well, then they can be useful and nice and helpful. But if cultures are interacting with them poorly, then they become monsters. I think kind of an interesting moment for me in thinking about that, that might connect to a lot of young people. During the pandemic, I binged Avatar because I was an adult when it came out and had kind of watched some of it, but was finishing up school, and so
I've never seen those movies. At least the first one, or any of them. I've never seen any of them. I probably need to watch them.
Or the cartoon series, not the.
Okay, yeah, okay. So I saw like when it first came out. I think I watched a few episodes of it, but I was definitely out of that age range. I was already older at that point, so I never really paid much attention to it.
Yep, and that was kind of the same boat that I was in, and like the bits of it that I saw, I was like, "Oh, this is pretty good." And the follow-up series actually presents a lot of stuff that's really interesting to think about from kind of a world that's immersed with spirits sort of concept. But one of the things that they had an episode in the original series where there's this nature spirit that is just like flipping out and is like destroying things and is really dangerous. And this is where the Avatar learns to kind of go into his avatar state and go into the spirit world and interact with the spirit world. And he finds out that it's because the land that the spirit protects has been mistreated and has been abused. And once he's able to kind of calm the spirit down and deal with the things that the spirit's experiencing in the land, and the spirit becomes a positive, happy spirit again. And I think when we look at paranormal stuff, we're looking at a folklore where you have an entire world that's abused nature, an entire world that's abused the world around it. There's not any part of modern culture up until very recently that's had any appreciation for nature, any appreciation for the world. It's just been nature as a resource that we can take things from. And so it kind of makes sense that we would be living in a time where our folklore is entirely about disaffected spirits and spirits that are angry or spirits that are sad or spirits that are hard to deal with, especially given that it's a folklore that's also based in a time where no one has the tools or the attention or the concern to deal with them or interact with them. And so, yeah, you're going to have ladies in white crying out on highways and bridges and scaring people because that's all they can do. Like, because whatever it is that they're supposed to have been interacting with in nature, we've destroyed. And whatever people would have been interacting and working with them and keeping good relationships with them for the people around them are no longer there. We've wiped out those people. And so I think that could be an interesting thing to explore in paranormal realms is, are we able to look at what traditions would have been engaging these spirits before and either rebuild those, or are we able to look at them and kind of confirm with them what it is that they need in order to create more beneficial interactions where things go from being haunted places or from being places that are scary because these sort of dangerous paranormal things happen to places where positive paranormal things happen, or places where there's positive interactions with these folk creatures. That, and I think that's the thing, is like we can kind of talk about them as cryptids, we can talk about them as UFOs, or we can talk about them as demons, but it's like maybe they're just folk spirits, maybe they're just nature spirits.
And that's exactly how I've been looking at it for a while now. And there's been a shift in certain paranormal spheres that I'm a part of, where there's a very holistic view of what this stuff could be, and there's a lot of people that look at it as multiple things multiple explanations happening all at once simultaneously. And I'm definitely of the spirit model of things, both in magic and in the paranormal. And one of the things that I have kind of come to is that if you take ghost hunters and paranormal investigators specifically, who deal with what they believe are spirits of the dead, and they want interactions with them, I feel like it would be very beneficial for them to look into magic, specifically things like ancestor worship and necromancy, because that is contact with the dead. Now, obviously, the goal of necromancy is probably different than what these ghost hunters have in mind, but at least it would give you a technique to access these realms and communicate on an even keel, and not have it be so terrifying or negative.
Yeah, I think it would even give them like a vocabulary and a language from which to approach it and categorize it and explore it that isn't the sort of pseudoscientific language that's often used now, which might allow people to break out of certain models that restrict how they try to interact and restrict how they try to explore and understand it, and allow them something that's a little more holistic.
Yeah, I definitely think that the language, like, we've been trying to talk to the spirit realm in a very materialist point, like with a very materialist language for so long, and wondering why they're not answering back. And I think we need to start seeing magic as the language to speak to these entities in, and that's the language they understand.
Yeah, I think even even if people wanted something fairly modern, then like Cartesian spiritism could probably provide something that would allow a more holistic and positive approach than going in and trying to use devices to sense where something is and then running in and getting scared when you think that something's there. Because I'm sure if you have some blips on a meter and then you panic, that's not going to make whatever's there want to interact with you in any positive way either.
Yeah, absolutely. I've dealt with that a couple times. I mean, like, when you're out there and you don't have the context or the background to deal with these kind of things, it can be scary. And I've been out in the field and I've left way earlier than I wanted to because I just wasn't quite sure how to handle the situation. And now that I've been really in exploring and testing out different magical systems, and ceremonial magic is definitely where I feel most comfortable. I'm hoping that I can go out there with a new set of tools to contact and communicate with these entities on a more even keel.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and but so when people look at the ceremonial system, the first thing that most modern people would kind of cringe at is the heavy Christian context that it's in. And me, I kind of, like I said, I was raised Jutheist, and I kind of went a more polytheistic point of view because that I also have ancestry in that. When I started to look at the grimoires and the ceremonial system, I was very interested in it because it seemed like a very direct route to spirit communication, but the heavy Christian overtones, really, it was a big challenge for me to get over that and realize that just because it may, when you're working in a Christian context, it may show you that there's a reality to it, but that doesn't mean that the other cultures and pantheons don't exist. And that was the only way that I could really get into it, was seeing how they all work together. And I'm wondering if you've been able to explain to people who might, reject the ceremonial system in a way that they can understand, in a way that they can kind of move past the rejection of the Christian lens to get to the meat of what ceremonial magic is.
I don't know that it's something that I've spent a lot of time explaining. A couple friends have noted that like I kind of come off like I'm basically writing for lapsed Catholics, and so and I think that's definitely something where it's kind of reflected in my viewpoint that I guess I went through that rebellious phase of having to like turn away from all that and get it all out of my system and see that I could approach the world without any of that at all and just like not care about it and be like, okay, I'm completely out of the influence of my Christian upbringing. And then once I kind of got to that point where it's like, okay, this doesn't have to influence me anymore, then it's like, okay, now I can be comfortable being in that environment and appreciate it and enjoy it. And I guess maybe that's something that people who have trauma there or have experiences that create hangups, maybe getting to that point where you hit that bottom of like, okay, this no longer has any power or any influence over me, can be helpful or useful. And then at that point, you can kind of explore how much it's going to be part of what you do and be comfortable with that at that point. And it's something where you can then have a determination of where it fits into your life. Whereas if it's something that you've got a lot of baggage around it, then that baggage is always going to kind of determine where it fits in your life. And I think even people who didn't grow up in it, just growing up in any Anglosphere culture, then there's going to be baggage around that because it's such a big part of what shaped it, particularly in the United States, where it's our founding, not necessarily like our founding fathers as a country, since a lot of them were involved in other sorts of things, but just the founding of like the colonies originally and the shaping of the colonies and how they were defined had different types of Christianity in their DNA. That's going to be something where it's inescapable. So I can see where, yeah, people might have baggage around that. And it might be difficult to deal with that if you haven't processed that baggage. And so I think processing that baggage is the big thing. But I think, yeah, after that, once that's kind of out of the way, then you can kind of look at it as the universe is huge. And so there's ways to look at that and approach that, where it isn't necessarily exclusive and where there's room for lots of different things. And I guess for me, sort of I know in the grimoire community, Neoplatonism gets a lot of flack because there's a couple writers that don't like it and have sort of spread that dislike out to other people. But I think a lot of people who give it flack don't necessarily think about like what it really deals with and how it underlies a lot of things that we experience and that are out there. But sort of from a Neoplatonic ideal, like you have that monotheism, you have that kind of unknowable divinity, and it's so far away and so unknowable and so incomprehensible and indescribable that it's like, okay, it's there, whatever. It's not the thing that is on the ground dealing with your daily life and the thing that's impacting your daily life. And then you have kind of aeon or time or like the initial sort of Demiurgos, the divine worker. And so you have that kind of more like existent, comprehensible, understandable deity that begins the shaping of the world. And that's something where, yeah, you can kind of address that. You can kind of recognize that provides context, and that context is important to everything else that exists and sort of underlies everything. And I mean, even in not in a Neoplatonic sense, in an Egyptian sense, you have the same sort of concept with Heka, that you have the magic that underwrites the entire universe, and even the gods are bound by Heka, and that they can be threatened with calling upon Heka, and they can swear oaths based on Heka. And we see that in a Greek context where you have certain fundamental structures in the universe that they can impact the gods, and the gods swear by, because they're the basic thing that provides context to existence. And I think that's what Plato and the people who followed Plato were getting at when they addressed sort of time as the ultimate sort of knowable deity beyond the absolute, that time and space provide that structure for everything. I mean, if we were to take science and make a religion out of physics, then space-time would essentially be the kind of underlying manifest God that exists, in which the concourse of forces is contextualized.
That's a really good view. I like that a lot.
Yeah. So I think when we kind of trash Neoplatonism, we're not recognizing that that's really all it is. It's just recognizing that. And so from there, you have the whole diversity of creation, which includes all of the different gods and spirits and saints and angels and everything that exists. And I think that, again, is sort of the view that Catholicism had, was that you've got kind of this unknowable deity that's the ultimate beauty and the ultimate goodness, but aside from that, can't really be described. And then you have kind of the more noble reflection or echo of that, that gets described in earlier scripture and gets described as kind of creating the world. And then from there, you have all of the various things that exist in the world. And I think that's how, when we look at historical Catholicism, we're able to see historical Catholic thinkers who were able to talk about figures from mythology and treat those figures in mythology with some level of realness and some level of appreciation without looking at them as bad, because the world is just big and just includes all of that. And like, if we look at stories of saints driving out demons in several instances, it's clear that they're driving out demons who were posing as gods, demons who were not the actual gods, but were pretending to be gods and receiving the sacrifices and offerings for those gods. And so there's kind of the sense of, well, these demons were lying to people, and so they're bad, and so they have to be driven out. And that's not quite the same as saying, like, oh, it's horrible that anyone would think about these other divine concepts, because those other divine concepts still became part of art and philosophy and how things were explained through history, for Catholic thinkers. And so there was still room for that in historical Catholicism. And I'm not saying that your modern magician needs to just go be a Catholic and needs to just embrace Catholicism and just say, like, oh, well, you can be a Catholic and you can have all these gods and all these other saints and powers and spirits in your Catholicism. I'm saying that you can have that Catholicism, and next to your Catholicism, you can have your Greek paganism. Next to your Greek paganism, you can have your Egyptian paganism, and you can have your sorcery, and you can have your obeah, and you can have your lukumi, and whatever else it is that's out there, because the world is this huge pluralism, and there's lots of different ways of understanding the different parts of it, because all those parts are there. But overarchingly, all of that exists within that space-time context. And so you have Aeon there at the top of it, and Aeon is a reflection of Kalon, of beauty, and Agatha, of goodness. And beauty and goodness are essentially what Christ talks about when he talks about the Father, which is also how the Hermetic texts describe the ultimate God. And so having that as something where those things can be adjacent to one another, and you can approach those sorts of systems just like you approach any sort of system. You just sort of treat each of them individually as they need to be treated, and approach each one individually as it needs to be approached, with all of its parts intact. And then as you get used to doing that, then it's easy to start to say, okay, well, here's all of these discrete pieces that I can deal with, and these discrete pieces that I can be part of, and I can go through the initiations and the systems and the training and development in each of these different things and utilize the tools from them in their own context. Now I can start to personalize and say, okay, when I'm just kind of doing things myself and interacting with the world myself, and with those things that I have relationships with, these are the things that are useful for doing that. And I can build something that's my personal way of doing things that comprises all of these. Now, I think it's important that when we have those personal ways that comprise stuff from a lot of different systems, that we recognize that that's for us individually. And when we turn around to the rest of the world, like, we don't give them Catholic, Irish, Lakumi Kimbanda. Like, that's not something that exists. So the tendency of like sort of 90s eclecticism to try to like blend everything, it doesn't make sense. It's something that we do out in a public space, but being informed by many things in a private space works. And I think we can start to have where we do come up with things that are holistic systems that we create that we can share with others, that are informed by lots of other things, where we're not trying to claim that we are making something that's a blend of these things, or that we're using all of these things or communicating all of these things at once, or communicating something new in that case. But we also probably need to be clear where we're being informed by things and how we're being inspired by things, but how what we're doing is not necessarily the same as what it is that we're being informed by or inspired by. And I think once we start doing that, then people who are not comfortable with like necessarily going to mass or going to stations or going to receive sacraments, then you still might be able to be comfortable with reading a prayer from a medieval prayer book, which a lot of the grimoires, that's where they are maintained in manuscripts, is with prayer books, with lapidaries, with medical books. And I mean, there are some that are just collections of grimoires too, but there's a lot of overlap between those things. And so being able to approach those things and read those things and use those things and appreciate them, I think the ability to appreciate them is a big part of being able to use them. Because if you can't appreciate it, then you're going to be at a point where you have some discomfort. And I don't think it's like sort of the standard way that we used to all be told things, where you have to believe what you're doing, you have to be comfortable with what you're doing, you have to be able to inhabit that in order for it to work. You can do something and think that it's going horribly and not working at all, and it can work. You can think you're messing up horribly and it could still work. But I think there's also a way that you can engage things more holistically and powerfully, and where you get more out of it, and you're in a space in order to be able to more cleanly and clearly engage what's happening, if you can be comfortable with what you're doing and really embody what you're doing. So like one thing that I'll often talk about with prayer is that when you are saying a prayer, a lot of times the prayers are going to be things that we have repeated from other sources. They're not us talking extemporaneously. And so we need to be able to embody each word of it and really like inhabit that and understand what those words are. So like if we say a Hail Mary, then when we're saying the Hail Mary, then we need to look at what each part of that experience is that's being described or talked about with each word of the prayer. And it's sort of like Lectio Divina, where you are reading a Bible passage and kind of trying to inhabit the space of it and immerse yourself in the imagination of what the experience of that gospel story or Hebrew scripture story is. And so I think doing that in prayer, where you're really embodying and exploring what the experience of the words is, allows you to connect with it and connect with the forces and powers and spirits that are related to that prayer more clearly and more powerfully. And you can bring that same type of thing to the table when you're doing magical ritual, if you know the ritual well, or if you're comfortable with the words and names in the ritual, but also comfortable with the content of the ritual. If it's something where you are trying to negotiate your ability to accept and understand it, then that is going to make it a lot more difficult to do.
Well, that was very beautifully said, and a perfect way to wrap this up. But before we do, where can people find your material? Where can people find you?
Well, I guess the place that I'm most active is Facebook, which I guess at this point is where we put ourselves out of reach for newer generations. But I am trying to be active on Twitter, but I'm very bad at it. And eventually would like to get active on Instagram, but haven't been able to get myself to explore that more deeply. My books are available on Amazon and also on Barnes and Noble. I know some people don't like to deal with Amazon, so I try to put everything on Barnes and Noble also. There's my website, arita418.com, or my blog.arita418.com. And those are kind of the spaces to keep up with what I'm doing. And there's a lot on the blog. I tend to write very lengthy blog posts when I write them. And then the website has hours and hours of free audio classes available, and we'll eventually have more available as well. But those are kind of the spaces where you can keep up with what I'm doing. Or again, just on Facebook. My blog's Facebook page is Glory of the Stars, and my author page is Bj Swain, author, or something like that.
I'll make sure to put all these links in the description.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And thank you so much for coming on. And we're going to go over on Patreon now. So for anyone who's listening and not a patron, I highly recommend you sign up, because you get to hear extra conversations like the one we're about to have. So BJ, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And that was my interview with Bj Swain. I could not think of a more interesting and knowledgeable person to talk to about magic and the occult, and I'm very excited to have him back on for future shows. Again, all of his links and where to buy his books will be in the show notes below. That's it for tonight, and until next time, I hope to see you again in the Strange Dominions.